Welcome to the final session. You made it, of the ecosystem track. I'm Dan Powers. I work at Docker. Been there for about 4 years, work on partner technology sort of stuff. And always enjoy emceeing this, whether it's track A or track B or whatever DockerCon it's at, because you hear lots of interesting things in the ecosystems area. Now what we're going to do is Sheng Liang, who's the CEO of Rancher, is going to give us a presentation on how to make Kubernetes work for everyone. It's a bit of a change from the published program one, but it's going to try to brush on the serverless side as well. So please welcome Sheng Liang.
Well, thank you. I really again have to start with an apology because one of my co-founders and chief architect Darren Shepard was supposed to be here, and he had some personal commitments and he couldn't make it, and as a result, we had to change the content of this talk because I just cannot. I thought about just gave his talk, but there's just so much. I mean, there's not only demo, but just sort of the philosophical stuff, the comments. It's just really hard to do. I can't possibly do it. So I'm gonna just end up doing something I'm more comfortable with, and I think it'll probably work out better. And I also really appreciate Docker for giving us this opportunity to be part of the ecosystem. It is really the greatest part of Docker, besides the technology, I think, is the ecosystem. And we've, Rancher as a company would not have existed if it weren't for the Docker ecosystem. And we've been fortunate enough to be part of this event from really from year one, and we've always participated. And I kind of, this is sort of sets the context of my talk. Like this morning, I'm sure many of you were on the keynote. There was a lot of talk about developers and Docker Desktop Enterprise Edition, enabling developers to directly deploy things in production and stuff. So this stuff is probably getting blurred over time, But the way we look at it is as actually, strictly speaking, there's probably 3 stages as opposed to just 2. Most developers, like I used to be one, and I think of not necessarily developers that build Docker containers. They're probably developers that write in the IDE, and they honestly couldn't even be bothered to wait till the container builds. So they would like to usually run it as loose code immediately, right, and see the results. And then usually it takes like a build release engineer or something, a DevOps engineer to basically take that stuff and package it as a Docker container. So usually, at least in our world, we tend to think the middle part as DevOps as opposed to be developers. And then deploy on Kubernetes, that's sort of DevOps and IT ops. And this is, when we got started, it wasn't quite like this. I think, Rancher, we used to support Swarm and Mesos. There used to be really a lot more choices. And Swarm is still very much live and thriving, but Kubernetes, though, it really has the most momentum. And these days, deploying on Kubernetes is pretty much being viewed as a de facto thing to do. But we created a Rancher, as some of you may know, and some of you may not know. But it is we kind of created a platform to help people finish the last stage of that journey, and we have a particular focus on multi-cluster management because if you think about it, the process of managing a single cluster is pretty well solved by Kubernetes. So one area that a lot of our customers have been struggling with, users have been struggling with really from day one, was when Kubernetes was designed, it came from Google Borg. You think about Borg, it's a very large pool of resources, and And it turned out it takes quite a bit of expertise to manage that humongous cluster. And what we've seen is people in the real world these days, they tend to run many clusters, and especially with cloud infrastructure, where the overhead of running a cluster is actually pretty small, because you can have pretty small instances. And in fact, on a lot of these cloud managed Kubernetes services, like GKE, for example, the resource it takes to run etcd and Kubernetes masters even giving it to you for free. So that really encouraged a lot of small clusters to happen. But then in a large organization, what tend to happen is some teams, they would decide to choose one particular form of infrastructure. They may decide to deploy their things on premise. Another team may decide to use one cloud, say AWS. Another team may decide to use another cloud like Azure. So they not only create multiple clusters, but they create these clusters on different clouds. And the great thing about Kubernetes, they all, once you have Kubernetes clusters, they more or less look and feel the same way. And you can have, unlike traditional paths where there's just a lot of constraint when it comes to languages and frameworks, you have all the freedom of doing whatever you want to do. You can do Windows even, and Linux and Java. It doesn't make any difference. So. And really what Rancher end up being this platform that manages all that underlying infrastructure coming from the cloud, and then enables the DevOps organization to basically deploy their applications in ways that in the infrastructure platform they prefer, and the technology stack they choose, and IT to have centralized control. And we've been very successful. Like, this is 100% open source software. It's been adopted by, downloaded over 100 million times, and probably used by tens of thousands, more than tens of thousands of users worldwide. So every dot is sort of an aggregated number of users. And you see, like, Europe has been very, very popular, because Europe has more countries. So you end up having these modest-sized circles. Obviously, not surprisingly, the largest number of users for Rancher is in the U.S. Then the second largest is in China. But then you look at Germany and France. They're really not far behind. And then we're 100% open source software. It was sort of in some ways like we have some feature overlap with Docker Data Center or Docker EE, but there's one big difference is we're 100% open source, like I said, so we just sell support. And when some of these, on our website, I'm not going to talk too much about this, but one thing I want to point out is you see the success of Docker, success of Kubernetes, success of containers. These images are kind of meant to showcase approximately what these companies do, and they're not your traditional web company. They're not Google, they're not Amazon, they're not Salesforce anymore, right? There's a train company, and there's it looks like a steel company, there's healthcare, there's just a lot of these guys, they're all really using containers in production, and this stuff, and Kubernetes, this stuff is really very real. But now I'm going to kind of talk about challenges, because this is really about, we've been working for the last 3-4 years, pushing the envelope of helping these organizations to adopt Docker and Kubernetes, and which is what most of you are interested in. And initially, a lot of the challenges being around operating. Kubernetes is not easy to install, but these days, frankly, it's becoming a lot easier. Like everyone knows if you set up Docker for desktop, it comes with a Kubernetes environment. And in fact, if you're in the cloud, like I think AWS is going to talk right after me. Like if you get onto AWS, you get, they have managed Kubernetes clusters, right? They're fully geographically distributed and all managed for you. And if you get onto Google, they have that, and they have even a cheaper version that it's in one data center, one availability zone, but the management plane is free. So you got all these choices. Literally, there was a time a few years ago we were selling just not even operating Kubernetes. Like 2-3 years ago, you could sell a Kubernetes installer for a 6-digit deal, because it was believed to be so hard. Now I think those things are worth nothing. But increasingly what we see is the challenge become use Kubernetes clusters. And this is a little surprising because we never really had a challenge about using Docker. So remember the first picture I showed you, the people developing IDE and people packaging Docker, and then people deploy production in Kubernetes. That's sort of the industry accepted standard. But in practice, this use Kubernetes is really where we see most challenges today. It's hard. Like a lot of times, some of our customers wanted our help, so we actually go in, even do a bit of a training. And on day one, they get Docker training. Everyone's happy, and they feel they know what to do. And second day, we get into Kubernetes. We actually lose a lot of people because it shouldn't be this hard. I just want to get my apps to run. And this is a great example, right? We used to have a version called Rancher 1.0 that really most people didn't use Kubernetes. It was more of a Docker composed kind of experience. People loved it. It's a simple environment. Developers are very productive. Raw Kubernetes, it's just too hard. And so this is the stuff that if Darren were here, he was going to speak more about. So we started a project called Rio to really drive the adoption. And Kubernetes is not the only thing. Like in this conference, there's probably not a lot of talk about service mesh. But service mesh these days is probably even harder technology than Kubernetes. If some of you have not heard about it, you should. So things are getting more complicated. But what we think, how can we deal with it? Because most of our Rancher users, they don't have a deep enough technical bench like a Facebook or Google, right? Developers are expensive. DevOps engineers are hard to come by, and they have very limited resources, and they want to put their resources on their mission critical, on their apps that actually drive forward their business. But let's look at what Docker did. 5 years ago when Docker was created, it really took. Container technology existed for probably more than a decade, right? A lot of these things were invented by some microsystems, IBM, Google, and they were part of Linux forever. But Docker was kind of able to nicely package. It's like a good bag of tricks, but it's very easy to use, right? So we kind of took the same idea. Now there's actually even more technologies. Honestly, they're even more complicated than things like C groups and namespaces. But you can put it together and you can do Rio. So there's an open source project that's a work in progress that we came up with earlier this year. And I encourage you to all take a look. It's still in its early stages. So if you see, you start a Rio app, it's really like Docker. This command line is inspired, is basically inspired by Docker. So I just run a Docker image, and I created a container, I guess an app with a scale of 3. But one of the differences now, once I run it, it's automatically. We even created an HTTPS front end to it, so now you can access it directly. And let's just say I want to upgrade. Now I want to stage the next version from V1 to V3, and now I got 2 versions there. So if I run the old version, it says hello world. If I run the new version, it says hello world V3. But now the nice thing about service mesh is I can actually start to redirect some of the traffic to the new version. So now after I said I want to put 50% of the traffic to V3, then I go to the V1 URL with 50% chance I can get to V3. And let's just say everything looks good, then I can just promote V3, right? Now from that point on, now I'm using V3. V1 is just no longer used. So this is very much of a Docker composed kind of experience that a lot of Docker users loved, and they always, we had a 1.0 product that was more or less built around this kind of experience. So we're basically, in essence, with Rio, we're bringing some of that experience back into the Kubernetes Istio world. And it's not a straight translation because it's actually a little bit more sophisticated than that. And honestly, the technology has improved as well. So we're really doing a lot to push it to the next stage. Then I want to just have one slide talk about serverless. Again, I can't do justice to tell the whole story like Darren likes to tell. It's actually kind of it's a hot thing right now, as many of you have heard. But But at the end of the day, I mean, some people say, serverless is the next big thing. Forget about Docker, forget about Kubernetes. In fact, forget about containers. That's already old story. We got to start using serverless. And then every time we look into it, we find out that serverless has a lot of promise, but in terms of real adoption, it's very early. But it's more significant than that. This is it's because it's so nicely phrased. I just have to put the exact Twitter text on. This is a text by Brandon Burns. He's a distinguished engineer at Microsoft, and he was one of the original creators of Kubernetes. So he really knows this stuff, and he's a little confused too. He's like, okay, there's people talk about serverless, which means you don't worry about servers. You just talk about. You can worry about, but he's basically saying serverless could just be like containers. Then you don't worry about servers. But there's something else called function as a service. You write Lambda functions, or you write functions, you write Azure functions, and that's really not the same. So serverless, a lot of people when they talk about serverless, they actually tend to be talking about things like Lambda, which is really function as a serverless. And Brandon's of the opinion that really serverless, the whole idea of a serverless could be broadened to include the kind of programming model that just involve containers, but without having to worry about the host, without having to worry about the node that the containers runs on. So he said if we could just do that, we could do serverless too. And in fact, there's also another implication of serverless. Some people like serverless because you don't have to keep a server running, right? If nothing happens, then you essentially don't pay for it, and you only pay for the duration it runs. So with Rio, we started to play with these concepts too, like in projects like Knative or OpenFast, and I think we took some inspiration from there. Like in Rio, if you start an app with some concurrency, what that's telling this app is it can maximum scale to 10 concurrent sessions, but if the session is actually, if you don't have anything going on, it will actually scale the application down all the way to 0. There won't be any container running. And when the request comes in, then it kicks off one container. And if there are more requests, then it kicks off additional containers according to how many containers does it take to run your concurrent sessions. So you can really, the boundary between something like Rio or something like container and serverless is actually pretty narrow. So that's kind of the thing I wanted to say here. And in terms of Rancher roadmap, really like what we're doing is we're going to bring something like Rio, which is in a form of it's probably a more advanced composed Docker kind of experience with some flavor of serverless, and that would kind of be primarily be the DevOps experience. Because what we've seen is many organizations, when they deploy Kubernetes, they're not happy with just exposing raw Kubernetes to their DevOps teams. They inevitably create some kind of a wrapping around it. And we tried Docker Compose. It was good, but it didn't give us everything we want. So we started doing Rio. Whereas IT is more interested in multi-cluster management. So this is about all I wanted to cover. I mean, are there any questions? I'd be happy to answer.
Hello. First, I will say thank you for coming. It was a good presentation.
Thank you.
So I saw when you ran a couple slides back when you actually generated the SSL endpoint. Is that always going to go to the Rancher cloud, or could that go where your Kubernetes?
Oh yeah, this could be configured. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
That's my only question.
Yeah. I mean, there's really no magic here. What's going on is Let's Encrypt can generate a SSL certificate. Right? So it's just a big bag of tricks, and I mean, in some sense, Docker itself is a bag of tricks, like all open source technology. And it's really these days, I always like to say there's really less hardcore technology, more just really innovative and fascinating, user experience and things like that. Anything else? All right. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Sheng Liang.